Yeah, it's not. But what I showed is that there is a chain of events. Every point that we look at that chain is limited, and that limited thing is dependent on something else. The question becomes, could this chain of events go back forever? Because if it goes back forever, everything that's limited dependent upon something else, is dependent upon something else, ad infinitum, then we don't have a creator. Yeah, things are just dependent upon itself. Or we could argue that maybe there's a cycle. You know how you got the water cycle. One thing is dependent upon another thing, that's dependent upon another thing, that perpetuates a cycle. So what people say is that there was a big bang, it exploded out, the universe gets to a certain point and then comes together under gravitational force called a big crunch, and then gets to that point again and there's a big bang. So this argument of this cycle, and maybe that's a possibility. And if that's a possibility, then again we can discount the existence of a creator. And I want to show how those two possibilities are impossible, rationally impossible. Let's take the first one, where one thing is dependent upon another thing that's dependent upon another thing forever. This is impossible. And I want to give an analogy just to explain this. The analogy that I want to give is a soldier on a battlefield. So a soldier on a battlefield, he's an obedient soldier, he waits for orders before he shoots. Perhaps he's not American. So, okay, maybe it's a cheap joke. So what he does, he goes back to the sergeant and he says to the sergeant, he says, do I have the orders to shoot? The sergeant says, wait, don't shoot. Let me find out about my orders. So the sergeant goes back to the major, and the major, he asks the major, do I have the orders to give the orders for the soldiers to shoot? The major says, wait, let me find out. And he goes back to the lieutenant. And the lieutenant says, wait, let me find out, and I'll go back to the general. And the general says, wait, let me find out about, and I'll go back to the president. And the president says, wait, let me find out, and I'll go back to the Senate. And the Senate says, wait, let me find out, and let me go back to another person in the chain of command. If the chain of command goes back forever, each point is waiting for the previous point, when would the soldier ever get the orders to shoot? He wouldn't, because he'd be waiting forever. So similarly, for my mobile phone to work, I require electricity, which also requires power stations, which also requires coal, which also requires plants, which also requires sun, which also requires nebulas, which also requires supernovas, and so on and so on. If that process goes back forever, then each point will be waiting for the prior form to exist in its first place. Therefore, nothing would exist. There has to be an initiation. So my mobile phone works means the chain of events must have had a beginning. But as I said, there is a second example, or second possibility that some atheists they give, which is a cycle. Things exist in a cycle. So you have the universe exploding out, reaches a certain point, and comes back together as a big crunch. And they say this is a possibility, this is a rational possibility to explain the existence of the universe. Obviously, if you start thinking about it, you realize that's impossible. And there's many ways of arguing why it's impossible. But let me give you one explanation. What they're actually saying is that before you have a big bang, you must have a big crunch. Yeah, the universe must come back together. And before you have a big crunch, you must also have a big bang. So one is a consequence of the other. If one is a consequence of the other, it is like asking the question, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? What comes first, the chicken or the egg? So if one is a consequence of the other, if Big Bang is produced from the Big Crunch, and the Big Crunch is produced from the Big Bang, then you still need to have something that initiates it, starts it off. And therefore, we can discount the theory or discount the argument that you have a cycle of things which have perpetually maintained the universe and the existence that we see around us. So what we have now shown is that things which are limited and things that are dependent cannot self-sustain in a chain or in a cycle. As a result, we have to answer the question, where did limited dependent things come from? They must have come from an initiating point. Now this initiating point exists, it must be independent. If it's dependent, then we face problems, don't we? It's a chain or a cycle, we know that's impossible. So it must be independent. For it to be independent, it must be other than what we've sensed, which is dependent. Things which are dependent are limited by their very nature. Therefore, this thing must be unlimited. So we've got an independent, unlimited initiator. Some people say, well, could it not be a mechanical force? Why does it have to be a sentient being? If it was a mechanical force, and I'll finish very, very quickly now, if it was a mechanical force, then what determines and dictates for it to have created? If it's determined or dictated, then it's no longer unlimited, but it's limited by the forces that determine and dictate it. It's no longer independent, but it becomes dependent. Similarly, if this force was a mechanical force, then the universe would have always existed as well, because it's perpetual, cause and effect. If it's always going to cause the effect, then the cause is eternal, the effect will also be eternal. But we know creation and the universe has a beginning towards it. Therefore, this thing cannot be a mechanical force, but must have chosen. For it to choose, it must have a will and intelligence. So from my mobile phone, brothers and sisters, what have I shown? I've shown that everything's limited and dependent, and ultimately limited and dependent upon an independent, unlimited initiator, I-creator, that has a will and that is has an intelligence, and that is what as Muslims we call Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Thank you very much. Cycle.
We'll open the panel. We'll open it to the panel afterwards, the floor afterwards. Go ahead.
Yep. Hi, I just wanted to go through some of the academic arguments, and then I will slowly move on to where my own opinions lie. I wanted to start with a quote from David Hume, which sums up a simple argument for myself. If the evil in the world is intended by God, he is not good. If it violates his intentions, he is not almighty. God cannot be both almighty and good. There are many objections to this, but none that holds God says that God is ultimately responsible for the existence of evil. Besides, if only God can create, he must have created evil. If somebody else, say the devil, created evil, how can one know that God and not Satan created the universe? Defining good and evil is a human act to start with. It is based on our perceptions of what good and evil are. This has been dictated to us by other people and other positions of power. It's all a question of logic for me. There's the paradox of the stone. Perhaps the best known of these logical questions. Can God create a stone so heavy that he cannot lift it? Either he can or he cannot. If he cannot, the argument goes, then there is something that he cannot do, namely create a stone, and therefore he is not omnipotent. If he can, it continues, there is also something he cannot do. He cannot lift the stone. Occam's razor is one of the other theories that leads into... Sorry, it's my first time publicly speaking, so I'm a little nervous. Occam's razor is the principle that entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity, and the conclusion, therefore, that the simplest explanation or strategy tends to be the best one. In the philosophy of religion, Occam's razor is sometimes applied to the existence of God. If the concept of God does not help to explain the universe, it is argued God is irrelevant and should be cut away. It is argued that to imply that in the absence of compelling reason to believe in God, disbelief should be preferred. Such arguments are based on the assertion that belief in God requires a more complex assumption to explain the universe than non-belief. One of the examples I'd like to go through this is Richard Dawkins. Just find the page. Fred Hoyle reportedly stated that the probability of life originating on Earth is no greater than the chance of a hurricane sweeping through a scrapyard would have the luck to assemble a Boeing 747 airplane. But it then goes on to state that, this argument immediately supports the argument for intelligent design, but then goes on to ask if the creator could create something that is so complex, then the creator must be more complex. It brings Occam's razor theory in again, because then the question becomes which explanation is simplest, evolution or complex design.